Snow whipped through the dark streets as his car screeched to a stop. Under the flickering streetlight, a small girl in a torn coat was kneeling on the icy sidewalk, clutching a basket of paper flowers. Her lips were trembling, whispering something to the wind, then she collapsed. He rushed out his breath, catching in the cold. One glance into her fading eyes and the world around him shifted forever. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you silently, arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. The winter of 2021 in Portland was colder than anyone could remember. The rain had turned to a thin mist that froze as it touched the ground, leaving the sidewalk slick and glistening beneath the streetlights. At the corner of Hawthorne Boulevard, beside an old coffee shop that smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt espresso, a little girl stood with a basket in her hands. Her name was Emily Carter, and the basket was full of paper flowers, delicate roses, tulips, and daisies. She had folded herself from torn magazines and leftover wrapping paper. She was only 8 years old, yet her small hands worked like those of an artist. Every crease, every petal carried a touch of care and patience. She wore a thin gray coat, much too big for her, and a red knitted hat that kept slipping down over her eyes. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her breath came out in tiny clouds that disappeared into the dark. Most people passed by without noticing. The world had grown used to ignoring small miracles and small sadnesses. But Emily stayed whispering softly to herself each time someone walked past. "Good evening, sir. Would you like a flower?" It never fades, I promise. Sometimes someone would smile kindly but shake their head. Other times they would drop a coin or two into her basket and hurry away, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. But Emily didn't complain. Each coin brought her a little closer to the bottle of medicine waiting behind the pharmacy counter on Belmont Street Medicine for her mother Laura, who hadn't been able to get out of bed for 3 days. Inside their small apartment, 2 floors above a laundromat, Laura lay on a worn sofa near the window. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. She was only 28, but the illness had stolen much of her strength. The room smelled faintly of damp clothes and peppermint tea. On the table beside her sat a half-finished paper flower, one that Emily had taught her to make before she left that evening. Laura had said earlier in her soft voice, "Don't stay out too late, sweetheart. It's too cold tonight." "I won't, Mama. I'll just sell a few more and then we'll get your medicine." Laura smiled weakly and whispered, "You're my brave girl." Now, as the clock neared midnight, Emily's fingers had turned stiff. She looked at the basket, only 3 flowers left. She thought about her mother's tired smile and decided she couldn't leave until they were gone. At that very moment, a dark sedan slowed down at the intersection. The man inside was Daniel Brooks, a hotel magnate from Seattle who had come to Portland on business. He had attended a late meeting and was driving back to his hotel, distracted by thoughts that never seemed to rest, contracts, deadlines, and a loneliness that felt heavier in winter. When the traffic light turned red, his gaze drifted toward the sidewalk and stopped. There, under the dim streetlight, was a child standing alone holding something that shimmered faintly under the mist. For a reason he couldn't explain, Daniel rolled down the window. The sound of rain and distant tires filled the silence between them. "What are you selling, sweetheart?" he asked. Emily's eyes brightened. "Flowers, sir. They're paper flowers. They never die." Daniel leaned closer. "At this hour, shouldn't you be home?" "I will be," she said quickly. "I just need to sell 3 more. They're for my mama's medicine." Something inside him tightened, a memory maybe, or guilt. He opened the car door and stepped out, the cold immediately biting through his coat. "How much for all of them?" he asked. Her eyes widened. "All 3, yes. All 3, she hesitated, then whispered, "They're $1 each, sir." Daniel pulled out a $100 bill and handed it to her. "Keep the change." Emily's lips parted in disbelief. "That's too much, sir." "Then think of it as a Christmas gift," he said softly. She smiled, a small, radiant smile that seemed to warm the night itself. "Thank you. My mama will be so happy." Daniel took the paper flowers carefully as if they were made of glass. He glanced at the clock glowing on the dashboard. Midnight. For some reason, he didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he watched the little girl disappear into the mist, her small figure swallowed by the winter fog. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Not pity, not guilt, but the faint flicker of warmth. He thought he'd lost forever. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He placed the 3 paper flowers on the desk in his hotel room, right beside his untouched glass of bourbon. The petals were slightly bent from the cold. The colors faded from old magazine pages. One was blue, one pink, one pale yellow. They looked fragile, yet they carried something that felt strangely alive. He sat there for a long while staring at them. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window, catching the city's dim orange light. Daniel wasn't a man who lingered on small things. For years, he had taught himself not to. Since the accident that had taken his fiancée, he'd buried his heart under schedules, reports, and flights. But now those paper flowers refused to leave his mind. The way the girl had smiled at him, her voice trembling in the cold, it had touched a place he thought was long dead. The next morning, he went back to the same corner. The coffee shop was open again, and the smell of roasted beans spilled into the air. But the little girl wasn't there. Only wet footprints marked the sidewalk fading into the slush. Daniel stepped inside the cafe and ordered black coffee. "Do you know the little girl who sells paper flowers out there?" he asked the barista. The woman behind the counter looked up, wiping her hands on a towel. "You mean Emily?" "Yeah, she's here most nights. Poor kid. Her mom's sick real bad. Folks around here try to help when they can." "Where do they live?" The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "A couple of blocks down above the old laundromat. Tiny place. You can't miss it. There's always paper scraps hanging from the window." Daniel thanked her, paid for his coffee, and walked into the cold again. The city felt quieter than usual. His shoes left marks on the thin layer of snow that had settled overnight. When he reached the laundromat, he looked up. On the second floor, a small window glowed faintly through a curtain made of mismatched fabric. And yes, paper petals, bits of color and string dangled against the glass like frozen confetti. He stood there for a moment, unsure why he'd come. He wasn't here to play the savior. He just wanted to know that she and her mother were all right. Inside the apartment, Emily was sitting on the floor beside a heater that barely worked. She was folding new flowers, the tips of her fingers covered in glue. Her mother, Laura, lay on the couch, pale and weak, wrapped in a thin blanket. Laura's voice was soft but steady. "You shouldn't have gone out so late last night, honey. It's too dangerous." Emily looked up. "But Mama, I sold all the flowers. A nice man bought them. He gave me a lot of money, more than enough for your medicine." Laura smiled faintly. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "Did you say thank you?" "I did. I told him they never die." Laura reached out a trembling hand and touched her daughter's hair. "You've got a good heart, just like your father." Emily paused, her eyes flickering. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Laura hesitated, then said softly, "Some people leave because they're afraid, not because they don't love us. But we're strong enough, you and me." Outside, Daniel still stood under the falling snow, looking up at the window, unaware of the words being spoken inside. He saw the faint shadow of the little girl moving back and forth. Then, deciding not to intrude, he turned away. Over the next few days, he found himself passing by that street again and again. Once he saw Emily sitting by the heater in the coffee shop, sipping hot cocoa the owner had given her. Another time, he caught sight of her, rushing down the street with a paper bag, probably carrying her mother's medicine. Each glimpse left a mark on him. He didn't know why, but he began thinking about things he hadn't allowed himself to in years. What it meant to care to give without expecting anything in return. On the 5th night, he couldn't stay away any longer. The city was wrapped in snow. Daniel parked his car by the curb and climbed the stairs to the apartment. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He could hear a soft cough inside, followed by a child's quiet humming. He knocked gently. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Laura, pale, thin, but with kind eyes. Emily stood beside her, holding a pair of scissors and a half-finished flower. "Hello," Daniel said awkwardly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I met Emily the other night. She sold me these." He held out the 3 paper flowers, still carefully kept in his coat pocket. Laura's eyes softened. "You're the gentleman who bought her flowers." "Yes," he said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure you're both all right." There was a long silence. Then Laura smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and exhaustion. "That's very kind of you, sir. Please come in. It's cold out there." As Daniel stepped inside, the smell of peppermint tea and glue filled the air. The apartment was small and worn, yet there was something warm about it. Something that made him feel for the first time in a long while that maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was people. And that night, as snow fell quietly outside, a strange peace settled over him, the kind that only comes when two lonely worlds finally cross paths. The snow kept falling over Portland, soft and steady, like a song that never quite ended. Each morning, the city awoke under a pale sky and a thin blanket of white. For most, it was a season to stay indoors to drink hot cocoa and complain about the weather. But for Emily and her mother, winter was something else entirely, a season of waiting, of hoping, and of learning to keep the light alive, even when the world outside felt frozen. After that first visit, Daniel Brooks found himself returning and again and again. Sometimes he brought a bag of groceries, sometimes a new blanket, sometimes just an extra heater. He never stayed long. He would knock, smile politely, exchange a few words with Laura and Emily, then quietly leave. At first, Laura protested. "You've done enough already," she said one evening standing by the door. Her face was pale but proud. "I don't want charity." Daniel shook his head. "It's not charity, it's what I'd do for a friend." The word friend hung between them, fragile and warm. Laura looked away, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then thank you, friend." Emily adored him almost instantly. Whenever Daniel stopped by, she would run to show him her newest creations: paper birds, butterflies, even a clumsy paper snowman. "Do you like it?" she'd ask, her eyes shining. Daniel would kneel beside her, pretending to examine each one seriously. "It's perfect," he'd say. "Better than anything money can buy." Sometimes when Laura wasn't looking, he slipped an envelope of cash into the folds of Emily's basket or paid the landlord directly. He told no one. It felt better that way, quiet, unseen, honest. Yet beneath that quiet kindness, Daniel was changing. He started leaving his laptop closed at night, spending longer hours just watching the snow fall from his apartment window. The loneliness that had haunted him since his fiance's death began to loosen its grip, replaced by something gentler, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. One Sunday afternoon, Laura invited him in for tea. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and peppermint, and the heater hummed weakly in the corner. Emily was humming a Christmas song as she glued colored paper together. Daniel sat by the small table watching Laura pour tea into mismatched cups. Her hands trembled slightly, but her smile was steady. "Emily tells me you used to play piano," he said, noticing a small keyboard tucked under the window. Laura nodded. "Before Emily was born, I played in a small cafe downtown. Music used to be my life. Why did you stop?" She hesitated. "Life changed. When you're a mother, dreams start to look different." Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe some dreams just wait for the right season to return. Their eyes met for a moment, just long enough for warmth to pass between them before Laura looked away, pretending to adjust her cup. As the weeks passed, Daniel became a constant presence in their lives. He helped Emily with her schoolwork, drove Laura to doctor appointments, and even fixed the broken heater himself one snowy evening. He never demanded anything in return. But one night everything shifted. It was late, almost midnight, when Daniel's phone buzzed. It was the barista from the cafe on Hawthorne. "Mr. Brooks, I think you should come. It's about Laura." Within minutes, he was on the road. Snow was falling heavily, covering the streets in silence. When he reached their apartment, he found Emily crying on the doorstep, clutching her paper flowers to her chest. "Daniel, Mama's not waking up." He rushed inside. Laura lay on the couch, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Without hesitation, Daniel scooped her into his arms and carried her down the stairs, calling for help. His voice echoed into the cold night. At the hospital, machines beeped softly while doctors worked. Emily sat beside Daniel, holding his hand tightly. "Is Mama going to die?" she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart. She's strong. She's just very tired." Hours passed. Finally, the doctor stepped out, his face calm but serious. "She's stable for now, but her heart is very weak. She'll need surgery soon." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover the cost." The doctor hesitated. "It's expensive," I said. "Do it." Daniel interrupted quietly. "Just save her." That night, as the first light of dawn touched the snow outside the hospital windows, Daniel sat by Laura's bed. Her face was peaceful, her breathing slow. Emily had fallen asleep in a chair beside him, clutching one of her paper flowers. He looked at them, mother and child, and felt something shift inside him, something that went deeper than compassion. It wasn't just kindness anymore. It was love. Quiet, undeserved, unstoppable love. He reached over, took Laura's hand gently and whispered, "You and Emily, you've given me more than I could ever give back." Outside, the world was wrapped in winter silence. Inside that room, however, a small, invisible spring had begun to bloom. Laura woke to the soft hum of machines and the faint scent of disinfectant. The hospital room was quiet except for the whisper of wind pressing against the window. Her chest ached, but the heaviness that had lived there for months felt lighter. For a moment, she didn't know where she was until she saw Emily curled up in a chair beside the bed, sleeping with a paper flower clutched in her tiny hands. Then she noticed Daniel. He sat in the corner, exhausted, his head resting against the wall, eyes closed. His coat was draped over Emily's shoulders. Laura stared at him for a long time, emotion swelling in her chest. She didn't remember much after collapsing, only fragments, Daniel's voice calling her name, the rush of air sirens. And now he was here, watching over them. When Daniel finally stirred, he met her gaze and smiled a tired, gentle smile. "You scared us," he said softly. "But you're going to be fine now." Laura tried to speak, but her throat was dry. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. "The surgery went well." She looked down at her hands covered in pale blue tape. "How did you pay for it?" He hesitated. "That doesn't matter." "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't just do things like that for me." "Why not?" he asked, leaning forward. "If it means saving your life, because it isn't right. You've already done too much." Her eyes glistened. "I don't want your pity." Daniel stood, his voice low but firm. "This isn't pity, Laura. I've pitied people before. This isn't that. This is me, caring." The word hung in the air like the faint echo of a bell. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Laura turned her face toward the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly past the glass. "Caring doesn't mean you have to save me," she said. "I don't want to be someone's debt or burden." Daniel exhaled, his chest tightening. He wanted to tell her everything about the woman he'd lost, about the guilt he carried like a shadow. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said quietly, "I don't want to save you, Laura. I just don't want to lose you." That evening, when Emily woke, she ran straight to her mother's side. "Mama, you're okay." Laura stroked her hair weakly. "Thanks to Mr. Daniel, sweetheart." Emily turned to him with a smile so pure that Daniel almost couldn't breathe. "I told you, Mama," she said. "He's like one of my flowers. He never fades." Laura laughed softly, tears filling her eyes. In the weeks that followed, Laura's health improved steadily. Daniel visited every day, bringing soup, books, and sometimes just his quiet company. But as she grew stronger, Laura also grew distant. She spoke politely but never allowed the conversation to drift toward feelings. Daniel sensed it, but he didn't push. He'd learned that love, real love, couldn't be rushed. One afternoon, while Emily was drawing in the hospital garden, Laura asked him to sit. The winter sun filtered through the glass ceiling, pale but warm. "Daniel," she said quietly, "when I'm discharged, I think it's best that Emily and I move. Somewhere new, somewhere we can start over." He froze. "Move?" She nodded. "You've done so much for us, more than anyone ever has. But I can't keep depending on you. People will talk. They'll think I'm with you because I owe you." Daniel's voice broke a little. "Is that what you think this is, debt?" Laura looked at him, tears brimming. "I don't know what this is. I just know I'm terrified. Every time you walk into the room, I feel something I promised myself I'd never feel again. Hope. And hope is dangerous." Daniel took a deep breath, fighting the weight in his chest. "Laura, I've been afraid too. For years, I've been living like a ghost. But you and Emily, you brought me back to life." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "Maybe one day I'll be brave enough to believe that." He wanted to say more, but the nurse entered, ending their conversation. Daniel left quietly that evening, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She looked at the paper flowers Emily had placed on her bedside table, bright against the white sheets. She realized something: those flowers, fragile and imperfect, had survived every storm because they were made with love. And maybe love wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the one thing that kept people standing through the coldest winters. The next morning, Daniel didn't visit, nor the next. Days passed. Emily asked about him every evening, and Laura would simply smile and say, "He's busy, sweetheart." But inside, her heart ached with every silent hour. One night, as snow fell thick outside the window, Laura found herself whispering into the dark, "Daniel, if you're listening somewhere, thank you for showing me what kindness feels like again." Outside the hospital, parked across the street, Daniel sat in his car watching the window glow. He'd been there for hours, unable to leave, afraid that if he did, the light inside him would go out again. He looked down at the dashboard where 3 faded paper flowers lay. He reached out, touching them gently, and whispered, "I'll wait, Laura. As long as it takes." The snow kept falling soft and endless, as if the whole city had paused to listen to 2 hearts learning slowly how to speak again. Winter deepened in Portland. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and every window glowed faintly with Christmas lights. Streets smelled of peanut and cinnamon, and the sound of distant carols floated through the air. For most, the season meant celebration. For Laura Carter, it meant healing, one slow breath, one careful step at a time. She had left the hospital 3 weeks earlier. Thanks to Daniel's generosity, though she still refused to call it that, she had recovered enough to move back to their small apartment above the laundromat. The walls were freshly painted. Daniel had arranged that before she came home. He hadn't said a word about it, of course. That was his way to kindness hidden behind silence. Since that day at the hospital garden, they hadn't spoken. Daniel kept his distance, believing she needed space, and Laura tried to convince herself that it was for the best. But every night as snow tapped gently on the window, she found herself thinking of him, of his quiet strength, his hands carrying her through the storm, his eyes full of warmth she didn't think she deserved. Emily, as always, felt things adults didn't dare say. One evening, she sat by the heater folding new paper flowers. "Mama," she said suddenly, "do you think Mr. Daniel is lonely?" Laura looked up from her sewing. "Why do you ask?" "Because he smiles like people do when they're pretending to be happy." Laura paused. The needle slipped from her fingers. "He's fine, sweetheart. He has a big job, lots of people around him." Emily shook her head. "But sometimes big people forget how to be happy, for real." Laura stared at her daughter, this little soul who saw the world so clearly, and felt a pang of longing she couldn't quite name. A week before Christmas, Laura decided to visit the coffee shop on Hawthorne, hoping to thank the barista who had been so kind during her hardest days. As she stepped inside, the familiar bell jingled. The air smelled of espresso and baked bread, and there he was. Daniel Brooks sitting by the window, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him, his coat draped over the chair. He looked up startled, then smiled, not the polite practiced smile she remembered, but something real. "Laura," he said softly, "you look healthy." "I feel better," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "You did that yourself." For a moment they simply stood there, the hum of Christmas songs filling the space between them. Finally, Daniel gestured to the seat across from him. "Please, sit." They talked for hours about Emily, about work, about little things. Every time she laughed, Daniel felt the chill inside him melt a little more. But when she mentioned she was still struggling with rent, he frowned. "You know I can help," he said. "I know," she replied gently, "but this time let me try first." He looked at her, admiration softening his features. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. And you," she said, "are the loneliest." He smiled sadly. "Maybe we both are." It was late when they left the cafe. Snow was falling again, large soft flakes spinning in the streetlight. They walked side by side without speaking, their breaths visible in the cold air. When they reached the apartment, Laura turned to him. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the little home glowed with warmth. Emily ran out, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Daniel, I made something for you." She handed him a small paper star made from gold foil. "It's for your Christmas tree." Daniel took it carefully. "It's beautiful." "We don't have a tree," Emily said, "but Mama says maybe next year." Daniel glanced at Laura and she smiled, shy, soft, and full of unspoken gratitude. Later that night, after Emily fell asleep, they sat by the window watching the snowfall. "Daniel," Laura began quietly, "but I was wrong before. About pushing you away." He turned to her, his heart pounding. "I was scared," she continued, "of needing someone, of losing them again. But life's too short to live afraid." Daniel reached for her hand, his voice low. "I was afraid too, but every time I saw you fight to stay alive, I remembered what courage looks like. Their hands met fingers intertwining gently, as if they had always been meant to find each other in the cold. Outside, the snow fell heavier, wrapping the world in white silence. Daniel smiled. "Do you know what I've been thinking?" What she asked. "That maybe love isn't about saving someone. Maybe it's about standing beside them until the storm passes." Laura's eyes glistened. "Then maybe our storm is ending." He leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. The heater hummed softly. The lights flickered like tiny stars. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the hum of winter, two hearts that had been lost for too long finally found their way home. From the next room, Emily stirred in her sleep, a faint smile on her lips. On her bedside table sat a basket of paper flowers, colorful, delicate, and eternal, a reminder that even in the coldest winter, something beautiful could still bloom. Christmas Eve arrived quietly in Portland. The city lay under a blanket of snow, and every window shimmered with golden light. Bells chimed in the distance, echoing through the crisp winter air. Inside the little apartment above the laundromat, warmth glowed like a promise kept. Laura stood by the window, her reflection framed by garlands of paper flowers that Emily had strung across the glass. Her heart beat with a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. Behind her, the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the room. Emily was humming a carol, softly cutting bright paper stars for the small tree Daniel had brought earlier that day. It was the first real Christmas tree they'd ever had. When the clock struck 8, there was a knock at the door. Emily ran to open it, and there he was, Daniel Brooks, standing in the hallway, his hair dusted with snow, a small box in his hand. "Merry Christmas," he said, smiling. "Merry Christmas." Mr. Daniel, Emily beamed, pulling him inside on. "Look, we decorated everything." Daniel laughed softly, his eyes moving over the tiny living room filled with handmade ornaments. "It's beautiful," he said, "just like you promised." Laura smiled, her cheeks glowing in the warm light. "We were waiting for you." He took a deep breath, looking at her, the woman who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "I thought maybe you'd rather have a quiet night." Laura shook her head gently. Quiet nights are only nice when you have someone to share them with. They sat together, the three of them, sipping hot cocoa while the snow whispered against the window. Emily showed Daniel the last flower she'd made, a white one, simple and perfect. "It's for you," she said, "because you helped my mama smile again." Daniel's voice was soft. "Thank you, sweetheart. I think you helped me too." The room fell into a comfortable silence. Then Daniel turned to Laura. "There's something I need to ask you." He stood reaching into his coat pocket and pulled out the small box. Inside was a delicate silver ring shaped like a paper flower. Laura gasped softly. "Daniel," he smiled nervously, "I know we've both been through winters that felt endless, but I don't want to face another one without you. You and Emily, you're my home now, so will you let me stay?" Tears welled in Laura's eyes. She looked at Emily, who was grinning from ear to ear, then back at Daniel. "Are you sure you know what you're asking for?" He nodded. "Completely." Laura reached out, her fingers trembling as she took his hand. "Then yes," she whispered. "Stay." The world outside seemed to pause. Snowflakes drifted slowly past the window, catching the light like tiny stars. Emily clapped her hands, laughing. "Mama's getting married." They all laughed, their voices mingling with the faint sound of carols from the street below. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep under her new blanket, Daniel and Laura stood by the window watching the snow fall. The city was silent, wrapped in light. Laura rested her head against his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "Emily used to believe paper flowers never die. I think she was right." Daniel looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't knot when they are made of love." She smiled, and for the first time in years, so did he. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, endless, and full of grace, as if the heavens themselves were blessing a love that had finally found its way home. Today's story comes to an end, but its echo still lingers in the heart. What do you think? Give us a score from 1 to 10 and feel free to share a few words in the comments. Every voice here is valued and heard. Before you go, let me ask you, gently, are you doing okay today? If your heart feels heavy, let this place be a quiet corner where you can share and find comfort. See you again in the next bedtime story, where love and hope remind us that no matter how dark the night may seem, kindness will always prevail.